The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle, as James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that day. At 28 years old, he had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 3 years, but the weight of responsibility still felt heavy on his shoulders every single morning. His tall black bearskin hat sat perfectly straight, and his polished boots reflected the early light like mirrors. James came from a working-class family in Manchester. His father worked in a factory, and his mother cleaned offices at night to make ends meet. When he was young, his family could barely afford a trip to London, let alone imagine their son would one day stand guard at the Queen's residence. But James had always been different. He was the kind of boy who helped elderly neighbors with their shopping, who stopped to pet every stray dog, and who never walked past someone who looked sad without offering a smile. The path to becoming a Queen's Guard hadn't been easy. James had joined the army at 18, worked his way through rigorous training, and proved himself worthy of one of the most prestigious positions in the British military. The role required absolute stillness, unwavering focus, and the ability to remain composed no matter what happened around him. Guards were not supposed to react, smile, or acknowledge the thousands of tourists who visited the castle daily. On this particular Tuesday morning, the usual crowd of visitors had begun gathering outside the castle gates. Tour buses rumbled past, cameras clicked constantly, and children pressed their faces against the iron railings hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous guards in their iconic uniforms. James took his position at his designated post, rifle in hand, eyes focused straight ahead. The tourists came in waves throughout the day. Some tried to make the guards laugh by telling jokes or making funny faces. Others attempted to distract them with loud noises or sudden movements. James had seen it all before. He remained perfectly still, breathing slowly and steadily, his mind trained to filter out distractions while staying alert for any real security concerns. As the afternoon approached, James noticed a small commotion near the main entrance. A family had arrived, and something about them caught his attention from the corner of his eye. There was an elderly woman in a wheelchair, pushed by what appeared to be her adult children. The woman looked frail, with silver hair neatly combed, and a gentle smile on her weathered face. She wore a simple blue dress and a pearl necklace that had clearly been treasured for many years. The family was speaking quietly among themselves, and James could sense there was something special about this visit. The elderly woman kept looking toward the guards with an expression of deep respect and admiration. Her daughter, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, was pointing out different aspects of the castle architecture, clearly trying to make this visit memorable for her mother. What James didn't know was that this elderly woman, Margaret Thompson, was 93 years old and had lived through World War II. She had lost her husband in the war when she was just 22, leaving her to raise their young son alone. Throughout the decades that followed, she had worked as a nurse, dedicating her life to caring for others and serving her country in her own quiet way. Margaret had always dreamed of visiting Windsor Castle and seeing the famous Queen's Guards in person. For her, they represented everything noble and honorable about her country. She had saved money for years to make this trip, and her children had finally convinced her to take the journey from her small town in Yorkshire to London. This was likely to be her last big adventure, and she wanted to make it count. As the family slowly made their way closer to where James was standing, he could see the wonder in the elderly woman's eyes. She wasn't just another tourist looking for a photo opportunity. There was something deeper in her gaze, a profound respect and understanding of what the guards represented. James felt a stirring in his chest, though he maintained his rigid posture and neutral expression. The afternoon sun was getting warmer, and James had been standing motionless for hours. His feet ached inside his polished boots, and his neck was stiff from holding his head in the same position, but none of that mattered when he was on duty. He had sworn an oath to serve with honor and dignity, and he took that promise seriously every single day. Little did James know that in just a few moments, this ordinary Tuesday afternoon would become a day that would change not only his life, but also touch the hearts of millions of people around the world. The elderly woman in the wheelchair was about to do something that would test every rule he had been taught about remaining motionless and emotionless while on duty. Margaret Thompson had lived through so much in her 93 years, and she recognized something in the young guard's eyes that reminded her of her late husband and all the brave young men who had sacrificed so much for their country. Margaret's daughter, Susan, wheeled her mother closer to the guard post where James stood. The old woman's eyes were fixed on his face with an intensity that made James feel as though she could see straight into his soul, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Susan noticed her mother's unusual silence in the way she was studying the young guard. "Mom, would you like me to take a photo of you with the guard?" Susan asked softly, pulling out her phone, but Margaret shook her head gently, never taking her eyes off James. "No, dear," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the chatter of other tourists. "I just want to look at him for a moment. He reminds me so much of your father when he was young." James could hear the conversation, though he gave no indication of listening. His training had taught him to be aware of everything happening around him while maintaining the appearance of complete detachment. But something about the elderly woman's words made his heart skip a beat. He thought of his own grandmother, who had passed away the previous year, and how she used to look at him with such pride when he visited in his uniform. Margaret had been thinking about her husband Harold all morning. Today would have been their 71st wedding anniversary if he had lived. Harold had been a soldier too, serving in the Royal Air Force during the war. She remembered how handsome he looked in his uniform, how straight he stood, and how his eyes sparkled with determination and kindness. This young guard had the same bearing, the same sense of duty that she had fallen in love with all those decades ago. The crowd around them was growing larger as more tour groups arrived. Children were running around, their parents calling after them to stay close. A group of teenagers was trying to get the guards to break character by making silly faces and loud noises. James remained perfectly still, but he was acutely aware of the elderly woman who continued to watch him with such gentle intensity. Susan noticed that her mother had tears forming in her eyes. "Mom, are you all right?" she asked with concern, kneeling beside the wheelchair. Margaret reached out and took her daughter's hand. "I'm fine, sweetheart, it's just, he's so young, isn't he? They're all so young." She paused, wiping away a tear. "Your father was about his age when he went off to war. I keep thinking about all the mothers and grandmothers who look at these boys and see their own children." James felt a lump forming in his throat. He thought about his own mother, who worked 2 jobs to support the family and who had cried tears of both pride and worry the day he left for military training. He remembered how she had hugged him so tightly at the train station, whispering prayers for his safety into his ear. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting a golden glow across the castle grounds. Margaret asked Susan to wheel her even closer to where James was standing. Other tourists moved aside respectfully when they saw the elderly woman in the wheelchair, sensing that this visit held special meaning for her. "Young man," Margaret said, softly, speaking directly to James even though she knew he wouldn't respond. "I know you can hear me and I know you can't answer. But I want you to know that what you do matters. Standing here, protecting this place, representing the best of what our country stands for, it matters more than you might realize." James felt his composure wavering slightly. The woman's words touched something deep inside him, reminding him why he had chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't just about the uniform or the ceremony. It was about service, about being part of something bigger than himself. Margaret continued speaking in her gentle voice. "My husband served in the war, and I know he would be so proud to see young people like you carrying on the tradition of service. You remind me of him, strong, dedicated, honorable." Several other tourists had stopped to listen to Margaret's words. Some were taking photos, but not in the usual tourist way. They seemed to sense they were witnessing something special, a moment of genuine connection between an elderly woman who had lived through history and a young man who was now part of that ongoing story. Susan was crying now, understanding how much this moment meant to her mother. She had heard stories about her father all her life, but seeing her mother's reaction to this young guard made those stories feel more real somehow. It was as if the past and present were converging in this single moment. James wanted desperately to acknowledge the woman's kindness, to let her know that her words were reaching him. But his duty required him to remain motionless and silent. Inside, however, his heart was racing. He thought about all the people who depended on him and his fellow guards to maintain the dignity and tradition of their posts. What happened next would surprise everyone, including James himself. Margaret, despite her frail condition, began to struggle to stand up from her wheelchair. Susan immediately moved to help her, asking if she was all right. But Margaret was determined. She had something she needed to do, something that came from the deepest part of her heart. With Susan's help, Margaret slowly rose from her wheelchair. Her legs were shaky and she had to grip her daughter's arm tightly for support, but her determination was unmistakable. The crowd around them fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even the group of teenagers who had been trying to distract the guards stopped their antics and watched with curiosity. Margaret took a small, careful step toward James. Her movements were slow and deliberate, each step requiring considerable effort. James could see her approaching from his peripheral vision, and he felt his training warring with his human instincts. Every protocol he had learned told him to remain perfectly still, regardless of what was happening around him. But something about this elderly woman's approach felt different from the usual tourist interactions. "Mum, what are you doing?" Susan asked quietly, staying close to support her mother if needed. "Something I should have done 70 years ago," Margaret replied softly, her voice filled with emotion. "Something I never got the chance to do for your father and all the other brave young men who served." As Margaret drew closer, James could see the determination in her eyes mixed with something else, a deep, abiding gratitude that seemed to come from decades of carrying unexpressed appreciation. His heart was pounding now, though he maintained his rigid posture. He had never faced a situation quite like this in his 3 years of service. Margaret stopped directly in front of James, close enough that he could hear her breathing. She looked up at him, her weathered hands clasped together in front of her. For a long moment she simply stood there as if gathering the courage for what she was about to do. "I know you're not supposed to move or speak," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "But I need you to know something. My husband Harold served in the Royal Air Force during the war. He was just 19 when he enlisted. About your age. He had the same look in his eyes that you do, that mixture of strength and kindness that makes a true guardian." The crowd around them had grown larger, but everyone remained respectfully quiet. Some people had their phones out, recording what they sensed was going to be a memorable moment. Others simply watched, moved by the obvious emotion of the scene unfolding before them. Margaret reached into her small purse with shaking hands and pulled out something wrapped in a delicate handkerchief. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a small military medal, Harold's service medal from World War II. She had carried it with her for over 70 years through decades of widowhood and the raising of their son alone. "This was his," she said, holding the medal up so James could see it. "He earned it for bravery in the Battle of Britain. He never got to come home and be honored the way he deserved. He died when his plane was shot down over the English Channel, just 2 months before our son was born." James felt tears threatening to form in his eyes. The woman's story was hitting him with unexpected force, reminding him of all the stories his grandfather had told him about the war, about friends who never made it home, about the families who waited and grieved and carried on. What Margaret did next shocked everyone present. With great effort, she began to lean forward, her arms slowly extending toward James. Susan reached out to steady her mother, concerned that she might fall. But Margaret's intention was clear. She was moving to embrace the young guard, to give him the hug she had never been able to give her husband when he returned from his service. James felt every muscle in his body tense as he realized what was happening. His training screamed at him to step back, to maintain his position, to follow the rules that governed his every moment on duty. Guards were not supposed to interact with the public under any circumstances. There were protocols, regulations, and expectations that had been drilled into him through years of discipline. But as Margaret's frail arms wrapped around him, something deeper than training took over. This was not just a tourist seeking attention or trying to get a reaction. This was a woman who had lost the love of her life in service to their country, who had spent 70 years carrying unexpressed gratitude and grief, who saw in James the echo of all the young men who had sacrificed so much. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. Margaret's embrace was gentle but firm, the kind of hug that comes from decades of love and loss. James could feel her small frame trembling against his chest, could hear her quiet sobbing, could sense the weight of all the emotions she had carried for so many years. The crowd around them was completely silent now, many people wiping away their own tears as they witnessed this extraordinary moment of human connection. Even the other guards at nearby posts seemed to sense that something special was happening. Though they maintained their own positions with professional discipline, James faced the most difficult decision of his military career. Every rule, every regulation, every aspect of his training told him one thing. But his heart, his humanity, and his understanding of what this moment meant to this remarkable woman told him something entirely different. For what felt like an eternity, James stood frozen in Margaret's gentle embrace, his mind racing between duty and humanity. He could feel her tears soaking into his red tunic, could hear her whispered words of gratitude meant not just for him, but for her long-lost Harold and every soldier who had ever stood guard over their country's values. Then, in a moment that would be remembered and shared around the world, James made his choice. Slowly, carefully, he moved his left arm, the one not holding his rifle, and placed it gently around Margaret's shoulders. It was the smallest of movements, barely noticeable to those watching from a distance, but it spoke volumes about the man beneath the uniform. The crowd gasped softly as they realized what was happening. This was unprecedented. Queen's guards simply did not break protocol, especially not in such a public way. But James understood that some moments transcend rules and regulations. This was one of those moments when being human was more important than being a perfect soldier. Margaret felt his arm around her and looked up at his face. Though James maintained his forward gaze as required, she could see the kindness in his eyes, the acknowledgement of her pain and her gratitude. It was exactly what she needed. Not words, but understanding, not ceremony, but genuine human connection. "Thank you," she whispered so quietly that only James could hear. "Thank you for letting an old woman honor her husband through you. Thank you for your service, and thank you for showing me that the young people of today still understand what honor means." James wanted to respond, wanted to tell her that her husband's sacrifice had not been forgotten, that young people like him served because of the foundation laid by Harold and his generation. But he knew that his gentle embrace had already communicated everything that needed to be said. After what felt like both seconds and hours, Margaret slowly released her hold on James. Susan was immediately there to help her mother back to the wheelchair, tears streaming down her own face as she realized she had just witnessed something truly extraordinary. Other family members who had been standing back respectfully now came forward, all of them deeply moved by what they had seen. As Margaret settled back into her wheelchair, she kept her eyes on James for a moment longer. She could see that he was struggling with emotion while trying to maintain his professional composure. His small gesture of returning her embrace had cost him something. Possibly his career, certainly his perfect record of following protocol without exception. The crowd around them began to murmur with amazement and approval. People were wiping away tears, sharing quiet comments about what they had just witnessed. Several tourists approached Susan to express their admiration for her mother and to ask about Harold's story. The teenagers who had earlier been trying to make the guards laugh now stood in respectful silence, clearly understanding that they had witnessed something far more meaningful than their silly games. Word of what had happened began to spread quickly through the crowd. People started taking photos not of the guards as tourist curiosities, but as a way to remember this moment of profound human connection. Social media posts began appearing immediately, with people sharing the story of the elderly widow who had embraced a Queen's Guard and received unexpected compassion in return. James slowly returned to his standard position, rifle held properly, eyes focused straight ahead. But inside he was processing what had just happened. He had broken one of the most fundamental rules of his service, and he knew there would likely be consequences. Guards were monitored by security cameras, supervisors, and fellow soldiers. His actions would not go unnoticed by his commanding officers. Yet as he stood there in the afternoon sun, feeling the lingering warmth of Margaret's embrace, James found that he felt no regret. Sometimes doing the right thing required breaking the rules. Sometimes being truly professional meant remembering that service is ultimately about people, not just procedures. Margaret asked Susan to wheel her to a nearby bench where she could continue to watch James and the other guards. She wanted to stay a while longer, to hold on to this moment and the connection she had felt. For the first time in decades, she felt as though she had been able to properly thank a soldier, to express the gratitude she had carried in her heart. Since Harold's death, other visitors continued to arrive and depart throughout the afternoon, but many who had witnessed the embrace chose to linger. The story spread from person to person, and soon there was an unusual atmosphere around the guard posts, one of respect and appreciation rather than mere curiosity. People stopped trying to distract the guards and instead stood quietly, seeming to understand better what these young men represented. James remained at his post until his shift ended several hours later. Throughout that time, he was hyper-aware of every person who approached, wondering if one of them might be his commanding officer coming to address his breach of protocol. But the afternoon passed without incident, and when his replacement arrived, for the next shift, James was able to step away from his post with dignity and tact. As James walked back to the barracks after his shift, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had changed in some fundamental way. The weight of what he had done, breaking protocol to comfort an elderly widow, sat heavily on his shoulders, but it was accompanied by a sense of rightness that he had never experienced before in his military service. Meanwhile, Margaret's story was already beginning to spread far beyond the castle grounds. Susan had shared the experience with her family group chat, and soon relatives across the country were hearing about Margaret's encounter with the compassionate guard. A tourist who had filmed the moment posted the video online with a caption, explaining what they had witnessed, and within hours it was being shared thousands of times. The video showed Margaret's slow approach to James, their gentle embrace, and his careful, deliberate decision to return her hug. Viewers around the world were moved by the obvious emotion of the moment and the guard's willingness to show humanity, despite the strict rules of his position. Comments poured in from people sharing their own stories of military service, loss, and the importance of honoring those who served. Back at the barracks, James tried to focus on his evening routine, cleaning his uniform, polishing his boots, preparing for the next day's duties. But his fellow guards had already heard whispers about what had happened at the castle. Word traveled fast in their tight-knit community, and unusual events were always noticed and discussed. Sergeant Williams, a veteran guard with 15 years of experience, approached James as he sat on his bunk. "Mitchell," he said quietly, "I heard something interesting happened during your shift today." James looked up, meeting his sergeant's eyes directly. "Yes, sir. An elderly woman approached me and the situation required a judgment call." Williams nodded slowly. "I see. And what judgment did you make?" "I chose to show compassion to a war widow who was honoring her husband's memory through her interaction with me, sir. I understood that maintaining rigid protocol in that specific situation would have been less professional than responding with appropriate human kindness." The sergeant studied James for a long moment. Williams had seen many young guards struggle with the balance between following rules and making appropriate decisions in unusual circumstances. "Tell me exactly what happened, soldier." James recounted the entire encounter, Margaret's obvious emotional state, her story about Harold, her careful approach, and his decision to briefly return her embrace while maintaining his post. He spoke clearly and honestly, without trying to minimize what he had done or make excuses for his actions. When James finished his account, Williams was quiet for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. "Mitchell, you know that breaking protocol is a serious matter. Guards are expected to maintain their positions regardless of circumstances." "Yes, sir. I understand the potential consequences of my actions." However, Williams continued, being a Queen's Guard isn't just about following rules blindly. It's about representing the best values of our country and our military. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions in unusual circumstances. James felt a flicker of hope but remained at attention, waiting for his sergeant's final judgment. Williams went on. I've been watching you for 3 years, Mitchell. You've always been an exemplary guard, punctual, disciplined, respected by your peers. You've never caused problems or sought attention. So when something like this happens, I have to ask myself whether this was a momentary lapse in judgment or a decision made by a mature soldier who understood the bigger picture. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of their unit. James felt his heart sink as he realized that news of his actions had traveled all the way up the chain of command. He stood at attention as the colonel approached. At ease, gentlemen, Colonel Harrison said, his expression unreadable. Mitchell, I understand you had an eventful day. Yes, sir. I've been receiving calls all evening. It seems your encounter with an elderly visitor has attracted quite a bit of attention. There's a video circulating online that's been viewed over 1 million times in just a few hours. James felt his stomach drop. He had hoped that his actions might be handled quietly within military channels, but now it seemed the entire world was watching and judging. Colonel Harrison continued. The video shows a Queen's Guard breaking protocol to comfort an elderly war widow. People are calling it everything from a beautiful moment of humanity to an unacceptable breach of military discipline. The colonel paused, and James braced himself for whatever punishment was coming. However, Harrison said, his tone shifting slightly, I also received a call from Buckingham Palace. It seems that when Her Majesty was informed of the incident, she had a very specific reaction. James looked up in surprise. The Queen herself had heard about what happened. Her Majesty's exact words were, that young man understood that sometimes the highest form of duty is knowing when compassion takes precedence over protocol. She has requested a meeting with you tomorrow morning. The barracks fell completely silent. James felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. A meeting with the Queen was either the highest honor imaginable or the most terrifying prospect he could face, and he wasn't sure which this would be. James barely slept that night. He lay in his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and replaying the day's events over and over in his mind. By morning, the video of his encounter with Margaret had been viewed over 5 million times and shared across every major social media platform. News outlets around the world were covering the story, calling it everything from a moment of pure humanity to when duty meets compassion. At precisely 9 o'clock the next morning, James found himself standing in an ornate room at Buckingham Palace wearing his finest dress uniform. His hands trembled slightly as he waited, though he tried to maintain the composure that had served him so well as a guard. The room was filled with portraits of previous monarchs and military heroes, and James couldn't help but wonder if he belonged in such distinguished company. When Queen Elizabeth entered the room, James immediately came to attention and bowed, respectfully. She was smaller than he had expected, but her presence filled the entire space. Her eyes, sharp and kind, studied him carefully as she approached. Guard Mitchell, she said in her distinctive voice. Please, sit down. James remained standing. Thank you, Your Majesty, but I prefer to stand. She smiled slightly at this response. Very well. I understand you had quite an eventful day yesterday. Yes, Your Majesty. I want to apologize if my actions brought any embarrassment to the Crown or to my unit. I accept full responsibility for my decision to break protocol. The Queen raised her hand to stop him. Young man, do you know why we have Queen's Guards? James had memorized the official answer during his training. To protect the royal family and royal residences, Your Majesty. That's the technical answer, yes. But the deeper purpose is to represent the very best of what our nation stands for. Honor, duty, service to others, and yes, compassion when it is truly needed. She paused, studying his face. Tell me about the woman who approached you. James described Margaret in detail, her obvious frailty, Her story about Harold, the deep respect and gratitude in her eyes. As he spoke, he could see the Queen nodding thoughtfully. "Mrs. Thompson's story is not unique," the Queen said when he finished. "I have met thousands of war widows over the decades. They carry their grief and their pride with such dignity, and they often receive far too little recognition for their own sacrifices." She walked to a window overlooking the palace gardens. "When I heard about what happened yesterday, my first thought was not about protocol or rules. It was about a young soldier who recognized pain in another person and chose compassion over conformity." James felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he remained at attention. The Queen continued, "However, I also understand the importance of military discipline. Your commanding officers were right to be concerned about the precedent your actions might set. We cannot have guards regularly breaking protocol, even for the best of reasons." James's heart sank. He prepared himself for whatever punishment was coming. "Which is why," the Queen said, turning back to face him, "I have decided to formally commend you for exceptional judgment and compassion in the line of duty. Your actions yesterday demonstrated exactly the kind of wisdom and humanity that we hope to see in those who serve the crown." James stared at her in disbelief. "Your Majesty? Furthermore, I am promoting you to Lance Corporal, effective immediately. Your ability to balance duty with compassion makes you exactly the kind of leader we need in the Queen's Guard." James felt tears forming in his eyes for the second time in 2 days. I don't know what to say, Your Majesty. Say that you will continue to serve with the same wisdom you showed yesterday. Sometimes following the rules blindly is not the same as serving honorably." As James left Buckingham Palace that morning, he discovered that the world had not forgotten Margaret Thompson either. The video of their encounter had sparked a global conversation about the importance of honoring veterans and their families. People were sharing stories about their own family members who had served, and donations were pouring in to organizations that support military families. Margaret herself had become something of a celebrity overnight. News crews from around the world wanted to interview her about Harold and about her encounter with James. She handled the attention with grace and dignity, using every interview as an opportunity to talk about the importance of remembering those who served and supporting current military personnel. 3 months later, James was invited to a special ceremony at Westminster Abbey, honoring World War II veterans and their families. As he walked into the historic church in his dress uniform, now with his new Lance Corporal stripes, he saw a familiar figure in the front row. Margaret Thompson, now 94 years old, was sitting in her wheelchair wearing the same blue dress and pearl necklace she had worn on the day they met. When she saw James approaching, her face lit up with the same gentle smile that had touched his heart months earlier. This time, when Margaret opened her arms for an embrace, James didn't hesitate for even a moment. He knelt beside her wheelchair and hugged her warmly. Two people whose lives had been forever changed by a single moment of human connection. The ceremony honored Harold Thompson and thousands of other fallen heroes. But it also celebrated something equally important: the ongoing chain of service and compassion that connects one generation of guardians to the next. James understood now that being a true guardian meant protecting not just buildings or people, but the values in humanity that make life worth defending. As he stood guard that evening at Windsor Castle, James carried with him the lesson that Margaret had taught him. Sometimes the most professional thing you can do is to remember that rules serve people, not the other way around. And sometimes, when an elderly woman who has given everything for her country needs a moment of recognition and comfort, the highest duty is simply to be human.